Right, good afternoon everyone, and great to see you here on this rather snowy and Arctic day. You all deserve a special points for making your way through here, through these kind of fairly hazardous conditions. I've heard that quite a few people are stuck in the traffic in general in Helsinki. But great to see you here today. And welcome to celebrate the Joint Launch Forum for Development Studies Special Issue on Nordic Development Assistance, and of course to discuss the future of Nordic aid. My name is Kimmo Ohtonen and it's my pleasure to be your host today for this next 2 hours. We've got a very interesting afternoon ahead of us and it's really great to have you here. And I want to welcome our Nordic guests, the distinguished authors of the publication and our special speakers of today. We've got Jan Pettersson, Managing Director, Expert Group for Aid Studies Sweden. Good to have you here. A Senior Researcher Elling Jonneland from Christian Michelsen Institute in Norway. Great to have you with us. Professor Anne-Mette Kvaer, University of Aarhus in Denmark, and she will be joining us through remote access. Great to see you, Professor Kvaer. And of course we have Marikki Karhu from Development Policy Committee, who co-authored the article on Finnish aid together with Jari Lanki. Great to have you here, Marikki. This special issue on Nordic was motivated by the pressing need to understand what is happening with development cooperation in Nordic countries by looking at the changes and continuities in aid for the past 3 decades. For many decades, Nordic donors were seen as a like-minded donor group providing generous aid with a focus on values such as poverty reduction and human rights. In fact, there have been significant changes in each of the countries that has started to challenge this idea. During today's launching event, we are going to take a closer look at these developments in the Nordic countries, as well as to discuss the implications for the future of the development aid. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to give the floor to Member of the Parliament Inka Hopsu, Chair of the Development Policy Committee, to open this event. Welcome, Inka.
Thank you, and dear audience, kära nordiska vänner och kollegor. It's my great pleasure to open this launch of Forum for the Development Studies Special Issue on Nordic Aid and welcome you all to join the event. And I think we will have this not online, but we will have a record from the event, so somebody who was not able to join us now can see the event later. Let me start by congratulating the team for the immense work done that provides us with better understanding of how domestic policies shape and influence development cooperation in the Nordic countries, and by so doing also in our international roles. I am also glad that we, as the Development Policy Committee, were part of this exercise. Special thanks to Marikki for this. Reviewing our official development policies, its main objectives, instruments and financing have been part of our mandate since the beginning. However, to do this analysis in an academic format has taken this task to next level and closer to the research community and our partners there. Equally important for us is to facilitate dialogue between policymakers and researchers and peer-to-peer learning. This launch and meeting around the special issue have provided us opportunities to do precisely that. I also believe that we share a common concern both on the future of development aid in the Nordic countries as well as the Nordic like-mindedness in more general terms. For many decades, Nordic donors were seen as like-minded donor group, providing generous aid with a focus on poverty reduction, human rights, sustainable development, multilateralism, and alignment with recipient governments' policies and other principles of effective development cooperation. I would say this support from the Nordic peers has been especially important to Finland. In this regard, this joint publication serves as call to action. We cannot take the Nordic like-mindedness for granted. In fact, this special issue on Nordic was motivated by the pressing need to understand what is happening in the development cooperation in different Nordic countries by looking at the changes and continuities in aid for the past decades. In addition, two authors were set out to explain these changes by looking at domestic politics to see how different factors have shaped their countries' development assistance and their profiles as Nordic donors. Dear audience, the study concludes that in fact the four Nordics were more similar aid donors in 1990s than they are now in 2022. And the members of the Nordic like-minded group have begun to take different routes, as the title of the publication also suggests. There have been significant changes in each of the countries that has started to challenge the Nordic model. Most notably in Denmark, which also catalyzed this research process 2 years ago. In the light of the elections in Sweden and Denmark, as well as Norway's decisions on aid levels, make this topic timely indeed. Not to mention the upcoming parliamentary elections here in Finland next April. You can already have a look of the different budget suggestions that the different parties have made. But now, great big thank you for the team and to Forum for Development Studies journal once again, and I wish you all for a fruitful discussion and fruitful event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inka, for highlighting the importance of the Nordic model from the Finnish point of view. Now it's time to let the team present the publication and its key findings. The special issue entitled Nordic Development Aid, Divergent Like-Mindedness consists in all 5 pieces, a joint comparative article that looks simultaneously all 4 Nordic countries. And just to remind you that the link to the publications can be found in the invitation, and for those who are interested in reading the whole issue, you can access it by Googling the name of the journal plus year of the publication, 22. And volume 3. The Norwegian and Finnish contributions are in open access format, but there are short abstracts made available of each article. So please go and take those out after this event and look at them more closely. Great. Now Professor Annemette Quer will start by presenting the joint comparative article, after which each of the authors share their main highlights of the respective country studies. Although the time frame for the study has been more in the past until 2021, we have asked the quests to also share their views on the present political situation and how it looks like from the point of view of the development cooperation. Good afternoon, Professor Quer. It's great to have you with us.
Good afternoon, I'm with you, and thank you so much for this kind introduction and the invitation, and giving us, the 4 of us, an opportunity to present our work. You know, it's very much appreciated. So I will share a few slides here, if that's okay?
Yes, the stage is yours.
Good. I hope you can see the slides now. Yes? Good. Thank you so much. Well, again, I'm so grateful and so happy and all for this opportunity to present our work, which I think grew on us a little bit, especially when we found out how difficult it actually is to compare and how many both similarities and differences there actually are. So we are looking also very much forward to the discussion and your inputs, and thank you very much for taking such an interest in our work. What I'll do is just briefly, and then won't talk for more than, I think, 10 minutes, but let's see, briefly go through what we've done in the comparative article, how we look at the Nordic model, how we then compare the 4 Nordic countries on volumes, on instruments and channels of development aid, and compare our development goals and priorities, and then look a little bit to how we think that we have to look to domestic politics differences in order to explain the increasing number of differences that we see between the 4 Nordic countries. All right, so turning to the literature, the Nordic countries are still characterized, I think, to an extent, in a sense, in the same way. So this concept of the Nordic model has been used, to denote a number of countries in the world who do good. Maybe it comes a lot from the social democratic heritage that many of us have, and the idea that global redistribution is a good thing. So it's been labeled things in the literature, and there are some references here. Things like Nordic exceptionalism, or the do-gooders in development aid, or the global good Samaritans. So that kind, and it's as was said very correctly in the introduction now. That Nordic model has been characterized by its generosity. So generally high aid volumes. Although of course, as we say, Finland has been a little bit less so, but still aid generosity, a focus on poverty reduction, and increasingly, especially through the 1990s, a focus on human rights, democracy, sustainable development, always multilateralism, like we've all been supporters of the UN, and also increasingly in the 1990s alignments with recipient government policies, so focused on partnerships. And this, of course, has been contrasted with those of the larger powers, such as the US, for example, which has had maybe less altruistic motives and focus less on development and more on diplomacy and national security interests and so on. At least that's how a very seminal book from 2007 by Carol Lancaster characterize and compare the US with Denmark, but as an example of the Nordics. Right, so what we of course, and which was also hinted at in the introduction, in the good introduction now, what we of course then argue is that, well, maybe this literature exaggerates the likeness, that we are actually growing apart a little. And so what we have done is to try to compare, and of course comparing is not easy, because there are so many different parameters. And we do look alike also still in many ways, for example, in our multilateralism. So we turn to some of the public policy literature to help us develop some dimensions on which we can compare, so that we know that we're not comparing, apples and pears. So what we did was to draw on the framework of Peter Hall, which he talks a lot about, policy paradigms, and how you have to, when you identify a policy paradigm, you not only have to look at goals and ideas about a policy, but also the instruments, different policy instruments applied, and then of course also volumes, size. It could be size of a tariff, for instance, or different sizes and volumes of whatever policy it is. And so that's what we have done. And so we compare, and of course I can only present the most general findings here, but first we compare on the volumes of aid, then we compare on different instruments and channels of aid, and then we compare finally on the goals and maybe also country choice of development policy and development aid. So in terms of volumes, as you can see, so the first figure here is the ODI share as percentage of GNI, and the second is absolute constant $29.18 US dollars. So as you know, and as the individual articles also describe, Finland has been a little bit, at a lower ODI share than the rest. Strikingly here, Denmark is now down at 0.7, whereas Sweden and Norway, at least until maybe this year, but I think Mariki and Elling and Jan will speak more to that, has remained at about 1%. And when you look at absolute dollars, you can actually see that Sweden and Norway are now way larger donors in terms of just absolute transfer funds to less developed countries than are Sweden and or Denmark and Finland. So that's a major difference now that Sweden and Norway just takes up more space in the international development community, you could say. In terms of instruments and channels, I think we have all found and discussed that we are more alike in terms of many instruments. I think here these figures show the share of multilateral, bilateral, and bi-multi aid. So bi-multi, as you of course know, is the earmarked funding into multilateral organizations. I think what stands out here is mainly Finland, and Finland is in a way a better, you could say, multilateralist, because Finland gives more core support, which is of course what many multilateral recipients would like, core without any earmarking. All countries, especially Denmark and Norway and Sweden, give more earmarked funding into multilateral funds and organizations, which can of course to the OECD DAC be characterized as bilateral aid. In terms of other kind of channels of aid, and Jan is the author of this excellent figure. I hope you can see it properly at your screen. So if you can see, like the first up here is the share of, and Jan, you must correct me if I'm wrong, but the share of bilateral aid to sub-Saharan Africa up here. This is for the low-income countries here, LICs. Then we have middle-income countries. Then we have share of bilateral ODA to the largest foreign recipients, the largest 6 to 10, and then to humanitarian aid. And Denmark is blue, Finland orange, Norway gray, Sweden yellow. I think, of course, you can discuss this a lot. I won't, but I will say that I think the most noteworthy differences here, we follow the same overall trends maybe, is that Sweden and Finland are the, give the largest share to the low-income countries, Norway more to middle-income countries. Finland is actually best at concentrating aid on the largest recipients. Sweden gives more to most to sub-Saharan Africa, and Denmark gives more to humanitarian aid. And I should say that this is a 2016 to 2021 average. Okay, so of course you can see we follow some of the same trends. If I am to say a little bit more about this, and then taking that as a segue to speak about goals and country choice, I would say that all of from our piece in the article, we noticed that all of the largest recipient countries for the 4 Nordics have been fragile states. For example, Afghanistan, or Yemen, or the area around Syria in this period. And all Nordics give about 60 to 70% of bilateral aid to the fragile countries. So that's more than the average OECD donor. But I would say that a difference here is that Norway, Finland, and Sweden still have, or still, maybe still, but they do have more presence in poor, stable countries, whereas Denmark has moved out of many of the kind of, you could say, traditional recipient countries such as Mozambique or Tanzania, where we are closing our embassy next year. And Norway and Finland and Sweden still have more of a presence in countries like Malawi and Mozambique. even if we all give more to fragile countries with conflict. So I think, of course, you could say that in fragile countries, there are also more poor, so it's only natural that we all give more to those. But the goal of poverty reduction has been somewhat diluted by other goals in all the 4 Nordics. You could say least in Sweden and most in Denmark. But we have all focused more also on climate, which is, there's no necessary, automatic improvement or reduction of poverty from climate programs, especially not if there are mitigation programs. So that's one, but in many of our countries we also now look to things like migration. We spend, of course, development aid on receiving refugees, but probably this is most like marked or significant in Denmark, where the new strategy, the world we share, and especially maybe if you read the government's 2022 development policy priorities, you will see how significant migration has become in development policy. So these, you could say these differences are also, notable when you then look at how the OECD DAC reviews in the peer reviews the 4 Nordics. So these are just some of the recommendations that we have selected. For instance, Finland is told in the most recent OECD DAC peer review to create a roadmap with annual targets to achieve its commitment to provide 0.7% of GNI as ODA. Sweden is told, for example, to reduce the large number of recipient countries, to concentrate aid more, to strengthen staff capacity. By the way, that's something we all recommended, to strengthen staff, more capacity in the MFA, not simply in terms of numbers. Norway is recommended to improve link between multilateral support and its country strategies, better alignment between core funding and earmark funding for its support for multilateral institutions. And then again, Denmark, I think for the first time this was noted in the 2016 peer review, but it comes out more like with more emphasis in the 2021 peer review, that we are advised to safeguard the integrity of our ODA. For instance, we are recommended to clarify the extent to which Denmark's development cooperation and humanitarian assistance is expected to contribute to reducing poverty and addressing inequalities. So, and also addressing that potential incoherence between our development cooperation objectives and domestic policies related to refugees. So again, there is some more like a little bit more of a red light here, I'd say, in the recommendations. So what we then conclude is that with regard to the instruments and channels, there are still many similarities, but that we can to some extent speak of different development policy paradigms in the 4 Nordic countries. So in other words, there is perhaps no such thing as a Nordic model any longer. And if we are to explain this, we can not only, like what the literature does, often looks at international drivers of development policy, like increasing migration flows, of course the global climate crisis, and of course all of that has a very significant influence on all 4 of us. But if we are to explain more of the differences between us 4, we will have to look more at the domestic drivers. And in the article, we talk about especially 2 things, I think. So organizational and then more political, coalitional, party competition, you could say. With regard to the organizational factors, the literature does emphasize the placement of the aid agency, so whether it is more like semi-autonomous from the MFA or whether it's placed within the MFA hierarchy. So if it's more autonomous, like for instance SIDA, or at least until recently, but I think still semi-autonomous NORAD, then development policy might be driven more by, international drivers, whereas if the aid agency is placed within the MFA hierarchy, it may be more subject to political, government priorities and so on. At least that's what we can see in Denmark to an extent right now. And then finally, the coalitional or the political drivers, we find that's maybe the most significant explanation. And what we did here, and again, Jan is the creator of this figure, which shows the share of parliamentary seats in favor of aid cuts in the 4 countries' parliaments. Again, Sweden blue, Finland orange, Norway grey, Denmark yellow. As you can see in Finland, only a very few MPs have actually been in favor of aid cuts, which probably reflects the fact, as Mariki's and Jari's article very well illustrates, how there's been this constant maybe aim for increasing rather than cutting aid. With Sweden, there seems to be not a very large share in favor of aid cuts, and it actually fell in 2010, but still, since then it has increased. And I'm sure Jan will speak more to this, because maybe that says something about what will happen in the future. And for Norway, you can see how the share of seats in favor of aid cuts is actually declining. And I'm sure Elling will also speak more on that. In Denmark, the center-right parties shifted after the 1998 elections to be in favor of aid cuts. Before that, there had been a consensus on the 1% of ODA. And I think what has happened recently is that a new consensus on the 0.7 share of ODA has emerged. So it seems like that's where we will stay at 0.7% of ODA. Both center-right and center-left parties are in favor of that, and only the far-right parties are not in favor. But then again, they may no longer be needed in terms of forming a government, so they're not as important. So what we of course also look at is how in Denmark in 2001, it was important to have the support for the Danish People Party in order to form a government, and that also influenced this policy, whereas for example in Sweden, the support from the Swedish Democrats have not been needed, maybe until now. So, but I'm sure other authors can speak more to this. So to conclude, and I hope I haven't exceeded my time here, we conclude that the Nordics have to some extent grown apart, and that we can to some extent speak of different development paradigms in the fall. There are questions that we can discuss, such as, well, maybe we will reapproach each other on some new paradigm, and maybe there's also a need to discuss whether there is a general shift globally in the way we speak about development aid. I mean, there's so many issues right now, for example, decolonization of aid, which is important. So we hope that our special issue can also perhaps instigate a discussion of that. Is there a general shift in where we want to go? All right, I think I should stop here and maybe leave the words to Mariki, or I don't know, but thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Anne-Mette, for this. Thank you for the fascinating overview, and now we can move on to examining each country's case-by-case basis. As agreed, you all have 5 to 7 minutes time to make your presentation, and after you've done your speech, you can take your seat at the podium. Let's start with Finland and Marikki Karho.
Thank you, Katja, and thank you, Kimmo. And first of all, thank you, Mette, Jan, and Elling for the whole publication process and for joining us today. I think last year at this time, I could only remotely dream that the work would be done. So I'm extremely happy to stand here on behalf of the Finnish team, my co-author, Alanki, our intern Antti Putila, and myself to celebrate this launch together with you and you, dear members of the audience. The purpose of our short presentation is really to highlight some key points for discussion from our paper that in essence looks at the defining factors in politics of aid in Finland and our struggle towards the 0.7 aid target. In many regards, and if you look at the official development policies, Finland is very Nordic, except for the fact that whereas our neighbors have been able to reach the 0.7 target already in the 1970s, we have largely continued to struggle, and we continue to struggle until now, with the exception of the year 1991 when we managed to exceed that. However, and interestingly for a researcher, is that our governments time and again reaffirmed the importance of that target and reassure the commitment. And this is very exceptional period of time in a way. In our study, we covered the past 30 years of that struggle out of 50 years. And we came to conclude that in a way, the question of development financing actually constitutes both continuity and change in our Finnish way of organizing and thinking about aid. The other kind of core elements that characterize Finland that you can see when you read all the official policies that we have had since the early 1990s include poverty reduction focus, but note with very often with other multiple goals and functions of aid. Not only Finland is trying to achieve poverty reduction in a certain geographic context, but also addressing global concerns with our aid, safeguarding global public goods such as the environment, peace, security, and more recently also climate change, climate and biodiversity. So aid is used for multiple purposes. And of course, foreign and commercial policy self-interest have always been there depending on the state of our economy at a given time or our own security needs. Also, what makes us a little bit different from our Nordic peers is that the role of aid has been somewhat ambiguous in a way how much importance and weight we actually do give on development aid, or whether we say, as we often do, that it matters much more what the recipient countries are doing, what kind of policies they are selecting, or how our other policy sectors are impacting on development. Last continuity, which is a very practical one, that until very recently, until 2016, our channels and instruments have actually been very similar and continued over the decades. But now, let's move to the change. So, in this equation, development financing represents us both continuity change. Continuity in terms of this kind of ritualistic struggle that we keep affirming to this principle, yet not fulfilling it. And what happens when we don't fulfill it, we kind of also create insecurity. How do we finance those goals? How do we actually, bring about the change that we have promised in our chosen approaches? And most importantly, when Finland has faced drastic cuts, like in the early 1990s or back in 2015, actually, it's not only that the cuts are meaning less resources to development, but they have left a fundamental mark how we conduct development, what kind of instruments we have. Take the example of the rapid rise of financial investments, so loans and investments instead of maybe that much grant aid, or also our bilateral aid, how it has come down during the recent years. And lastly, also statistically, the focus on LDC countries, which we have always struggled. When we have had cuts, the percentage to the poorest countries has also gone down. So why is that? Why it has been so difficult for us? So we actually have listed here a number of political economic factors that are quite timely if you think about the approaching elections in April. To start with the political factors, first, the structure of majority governments. So very typically in Finland, the governments are formed based on a number of parties across the political spectrum, which of course then increases the number of issues that you have to agree on in order to have a government and government program. In these situations, parties often avoid locking in positions. All those issues must be of key importance, normally domestic concerns, definitely not over development aid. Of course, this could be changed if we had very broad-based consensus and kind of a guardian angels of aid among the biggest parties. But unfortunately, when it comes down to real politics, somehow the support evaporates. And of course, the 0-point target itself, it's not that important to Finland in terms of our foreign policy, what it used to be in history. So in a way, you need to be able to fulfill that. Be a Nordic country, to be part of the UN, if you want to really highlight that you are a Western donor, that you have that kind of identity. Then going to the economic factors, and what strikes us in a way is that we have this mindset that we are very, very concerned over the state of economy also during the times of prosperity. Not to mention these times of economic downturn and very serious budget deficits. So, of course, this also works against aid. Then also the logic of our budgetary framework, where you have the 80% and then the rest, and aid being in the rest, competing with other issues. So it's very difficult in those circumstances when aid is played against domestic concerns to really make the difference unless we have budget surplus. And what was said about the kind of foreign policy value of the 0.7, now one would think that, okay, we have the UN Agenda 2030, and of course 0.7 is there also as a target, and also we have Paris Climate Agreement and humanitarian needs, but that hasn't changed that. So in a way, in the negotiations, those don't really wait enough. But maybe in interest of time, I will stop here and more to come in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Marikki. And now we move on to case Sweden. Jan Pettersson, welcome.
Thank you very much. So let me first start by echoing what Mette said in how grateful we are for Finland to hosting this launch event, and in particular to the Development Policy Committee and to Marike and Katja for making our stay such a pleasant one. So let me provide a brief overview of the Swedish case, ending with a policy paradigm shift. As you'll know, the conclusions will be one of a paradigm shift not having taken place as of yet. Just in brief, what I'm going to say is that what needs to be explained in the Swedish case is the continuity rather than change. So looking for lack of drivers rather than the domestic drivers. And then I'll look just briefly at some recent events. Starting with the continuity, this might seem like a strange figure to explain continuity. If you extend the graph to 1976, you'll see that there will be a straight line up till the end of the 90s. This is Sweden's 1% target. And why does it illustrate continuity? Well, it's because while Sweden has sometimes, and during quite a long time, during the 90s and the beginning of the 20s, left the 1% target for budgetary reasons, Sweden government has always adhered to the 1% target, arguing that when the economy permits, we're going to return to the 1% target, and one did. So there's never been an abandonment of the 1% target in principle. Another example for continuity is the overarching goal for aid. It's always been in terms of poverty reduction, and while it has been changed 4 times since it was first formulated in 1960s from various governments, the changes has been rather marginal. Another example of continuity would be in the number of aid recipient countries of Swedish aid. There's quite many of them. Sweden is generous also in the choice of partners. Those are, of course, not formal partner countries, but those are countries in which Swedish aid is spent. There's been numerous attempts to concentrate aid to stop fragmentation, but as we see, the number of countries has been pretty much the same throughout the years. And of course, there has been changes. There's been an increase, as Mette said, in earmarked aid, the multi-B aid. There's been a decrease in state-to-state cooperation. And in particular, there's been an increase in democracy aid, rising from some 10% in the beginning of the 90s to almost 25% of Swedish bilateral aid as of now. These changes in sum has, however, not been large enough to constitute any kind of paradigm shift. So why is that? Well, one reason is that there's been one party that's been kind of aid skeptical, or skeptical to the size of the aid volume, that's being the moderates party. They have not been always very large. They have not always been aid skeptical. Sometimes they have adhered to the 1% target even in opposition. So that means that aid has not been a prioritized enough policy area for the moderate party. So in coalition formation, the smaller liberal parties, the Centre Party, the Liberal parties, and the Christian Democrats has been acting as aid guardians, preserving the size of aid in even during governments of center-right or center-conservative rule. Another reason is the relatively small share of aid in the total government budget. It's been, earlier it was around 2% in the beginning of the 90s. And also high popular support for aid. Looking at some recent changes, we now have another party being an aid skeptic, entering since 2010 the parliament. So as Mette showed in her graph of parliament seats in favor of aid cuts, they are now around 40%. The smaller parties acting as aid guardians has shrunk. They're smaller today. And also there are signs that, in particular within the Christian Democrats, the voters do not favor aid as much as they used to do. So there's another composition of voters for those parties, maybe also. The share of overall budget has increased, now being around 4 to 5%, meaning that the policy area becomes more important. So if you think of a party like the Moderate Party, the policy area becomes financially more important, and therefore you will tend not to bargain it away as a negotiated outcomes in coalition formation as you used to do. And the popular support for aid is the lowest in 20 years in Sweden. So this altogether, I argue, speaks for quite a high likelihood of change in aid policy would the majority after the election change. And it did. So just to end with a first kind of note of what has changed is the aid volume for the coming 3 years, decreasing to around 0.88 next year and then going down. So the aid has been frozen at 56 billion Swedish crowns for the coming 3 years, implying that it will shrink in relative terms. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. That was very interesting. And now we move to Norway, and Elling Jonneland, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me and us this opportunity to launch the issue and to talk about some of our findings. When it comes to the case of Norway, our main finding is that we are talking about continuities in the Norwegian approach to and way of thinking about development aid. But there are significant changes under these, behind these communities, and the very recent developments with Ukraine, with the growth of the Norwegian economy, has highlighted those changes and may lead to a rethink of some dimensions of development, development aid. First, the aid volume. There has always been a broad consensus in Norway about aiming at allocating 1% of the so-called gross national income for development aid. It is true that there are two political parties in parliament, currently accounting for about a third of the MPs, that calls for a reduction of development aid, namely the Conservative Party and the more far-right Progress Party. But they haven't really made this a big issue. This can change, and it may change. I'll come back to that towards the end. The second important thing to keep in mind is that the growth of the Norwegian economy and its gross national income has been particularly high. And it's driven, as you know, by oil and gas revenues. That implies that although the aid budget has been at 1%, it has implied a very major and significant growth in the aid budget, from about 11 million Norwegian kroner in 2000 to 40 billion in 2020. This year it's about 46 billion. And if we were to maintain 1% next year, we would have to increase the aid budget by 14 billion. And we will be the biggest Nordic aid donor. But as you know, and as I will return to later, the government for the first time in its year's budget for next year proposed to cut the aid budget to 0.75%. They found it too difficult for economic reasons and in the face of popular outcry about higher living costs to maintain such a high aid volume. I'll get back to that. What has changed is certain goals, instruments, and management. Poverty reduction has remained an overarching objective, the primary goal of development aid, but it has been weakened, crowded out, you might call it, by the emergence of a number of new thematic priorities. For our discussion, the most important ones are climate. In the Norwegian case, there's a heavy emphasis on climate mitigation. It's peace, security, stabilization, not least following Norwegian engagement in peace mediations, which then, if successful, leads to that country becoming a major recipient of aid. And all of this has led to reduced aid flows to low-income countries and to Africa, and a corresponding increase in aid disbursements to middle-income countries, particularly related to climate issues. Secondly, there has, and we've seen the same tendencies in the other Nordic countries, there has been an expanding use of multilateral channels and institutions. There's been a particular strong growth in earmarked funding to such institutions. And this has been followed by reduced flows to what used to be the main partner countries, a smaller group of main recipients of Norwegian aid. So funding to those countries has been reduced. And the final dimension is the expanding role of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in implementing aid policies. While the traditional agency in charge of operationalizing and implementing NORAD has been weakened in the period, that is until quite recently. Why are we seeing these changes? It has partly to do with limited public and parliamentary debate, if you'd like, limited politicization around development aid issues. It's also about coalition politics. Aid has been a typical bargaining card to build government coalitions, and you have aid-friendly parties both on the conservative side with the Christian Democrats and on the left with the Socialist Left Party. And aid has often been left to them in exchange for other political concession. But perhaps most importantly is not only has the foreign ministry become more important in implementing aid, but the foreign ministry has also come to see development aid as a very important instrument to pursue Norwegian foreign policy objectives. It began perhaps with peace mediation and so on in Palestine in the early 90s, but it has expanded and continued, and it has also been evident in a number of other thematic areas. A third point to be mentioned there is also the expanding aid budget, which means that Norway is in a position to fund an ever-increasing number of priorities without having to rethink where do we have to sharpen and focus. And this leads me to the final slide, the present. And the key words is Ukraine and the Norwegian gross national income, which throws into the focus the role of domestic policies in Norway and a balance between what we might call traditional altruism versus self-interest and foreign policy objectives. As I mentioned, the aid volume has been reduced, although there is a strong political commitment to increase it to 1%. But it has been reduced, and once you have reduced it, it is politically very difficult to increase it. The second dimension is that Ukraine has, of course, implied that Norway spends a lot of its aid funds on Ukraine, partly on refugees in Norway, partly on humanitarian efforts inside Ukraine and neighboring areas, and a strong indication and calls for a plan from Norway with commitments that Norway shall help fund reconstruction in that country when that becomes possible. There is also an expanding strong focus on climate mitigation, to a lesser extent, but also, of course, on climate adaptation. But all of this implies that those funding for that will have to come from somewhere else in the aid budget. And that is increasingly implying, I fear, that there will be less funding from a country like Norway to low-income countries and to Africa in the years to come. And if Norway, which is the richest of the Nordic countries, or becoming the richest, can't afford it, we can't really expect that the others will be able to maintain those aid flows. Finally, in assessing the what will happen and in the balance between altruism and self-interest, I highlight two issues. One is the potential return to power of the two political parties that have been calling for a reduced aid. At the same time, the traditional alliance party, the Christian Democrats, has almost disappeared after the last election. So there might not be a need to bring in an aid-friendly party as a coalition partner. So that might suggest that aid could be kept at a lower level rather than return to the 1%, although there is much uncertainty said. The Conservative Party has also supported strongly the foreign policy dimensions of foreign aid. And then it's the approach to climate issues, global public goods, and the role of poverty reduction. How will I balance that? Focus on climate mitigation implies more aid to middle-income countries. Strong focus on poverty reduction implies targeting the poorer countries. So those are issues to be watched in the months and years to come. Thank you.
Take your seat there. Thank you, Elling. Thank you very much, Elling, for that interesting talk. And now for the last 5 minutes, we have the case Denmark. And over to you, Mette.
Thank you. So I will try to be very brief here, but just show you a little bit about the paradigm shift of Denmark's development policy, and really try not to repeat myself from the comparative piece. So as I mentioned before, we have compared on volumes and goals, instruments, and so on. So as I also said, you know, the volume of the share of Danish ODA has declined. But to elaborate a little bit on the goals and instruments, in addition to us getting more multi-buy aid, it's also the very significant increase in humanitarian aid from 7% in 2003 to 17% in 2021. And I mean, if we look at the 2022 budget priorities, if they are to be implemented, let's see. But then the aim is to increase allocations for what is called migration, areas of origin to conflicts and fragile states, from 3.5 billion Danish kroner to 7.5 billion Danish kroner. So that's a quite significant increase out of an aid budget of about 18 to maybe even 20 billion Danish kroner. It's at least 40%. So that's, I think, very worth noting. There's also, out of this 640, I think it is, million Danish kroner, aimed particularly at, as a special fund to have a more just and fair migration system. So that's the first time there is a special fund for this in the Danish aid package. I have already mentioned the general move out of the poor but stable countries, and the slide tells you a little bit, gives you a few examples. There's also less of bilateral aid to Africa, from 28% of bilateral aid in 2003 to about 19% in 2021. And as noted already, a lot less, or less of a poverty focus. I've also already cited the OECD peer review comments, so I don't want to go more into that. But just say then to comment a little bit or reflect a little bit upon recent developments. In the articles, we also look at media debates because we want to learn, when is development policy actually politicized and how much does that drive, changes in development policy. And so we counted here in the Denmark piece the number of articles in the major countrywide dailies, newspapers, And so the blue is 3 weeks prior to the announcement of the election, and the orange is during the election campaigns. And if you can see, in 2001, when the center-right Anders Fogh Rasmussen government came into power with support of Denmark's People Party, and then again in 2015, when the Lars Løkke Rasmussen center-right government came to power, that's when development aid was very much in the media, and it was very much in terms of cutting development aid and instead giving more of that funds to healthcare in Denmark. As you can see, for the 2 recent elections, and I just had time to put in the very recent election from this November, you can see that there are a lot less articles on development aid, so it's actually become depoliticized again. And that also, you can see that in the Danes' opinions on development aid. So the orange is the share of the population who thinks that we give not enough money to development aid. You can see that has declined, increased. And the share who says we give too much money has declined somewhat. So there has been a turn also in public opinion in favor of development aid. I think all of that speaks to a kind of a new consensus where we will remain on 0.7%. And so the new government, because it will probably be a government across the center, will probably remain there. I think the focus on migration is likely to continue. I wonder how much focus it will have. The time will remain, that will, remains to be seen. But I think one thing that we did see in the media is that there's not so much debate on development aid, but a lot of debate about whether we should have a reception center in a third country outside Europe, for example, Rwanda. And to the extent that of course also affects development aid, that has been debated. Okay, I think I will end here and we'll get to the common discussion.
Thank you very much, Mette. Let's give a round of applause to all our speakers. Thank you everyone for very interesting examinations of your respective countries. And now we'll carry on a conversation in a short while in our panel discussion. But now I would like to give the floor to Sami Pirkkala, who is the Director of Unit for Sectoral Policy at the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He will share his thoughts on the report and also share his thoughts on what he's heard today. Welcome, Sami.
Yes, dear Chair of the Development Policy Committee, Nordic colleagues, and all development policy experts. On behalf of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, I would like to thank all presenters for their excellent and interesting presentations and research. I have heard from Marikki about this study in different phases of its preparation, and I know that a huge amount of work has been put in this. The Nordic countries are a context in which comparative research is meaningful and bears significance. For us in Finland and in the MFA, this study gives a lot to think about. I believe that this applies to other Nordic countries too. I can assure that the findings will be further analyzed in the MFA and also discussed among Nordic development policy officials later on. The report and today's presentations provide interesting information on the differences in development policies among the Nordics over the years. Although the study points at increasing differences between policies over the past 30 years, it also shows that from a global perspective, the Nordic countries still have a lot in common. Just a few examples. We share basic values and have a similar approach to major global challenges like climate change. We support the multilateral rules-based system. We are committed to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its guiding principle of leaving no one behind. We share the ideas of gender equality, democracy, respect for human rights, and sustainable well-being. And we also share the underlying basic idea of Nordic welfare society and promote these ideas through our development policies. So, from outside, the differences between development policies of Nordic countries, even though increasing, may not seem as great as they do from the inside. However, the results of this study give reason to consider how the unity of the Nordic countries could be maintained and even strengthened in the future. As the study shows, development policy has been and continues to be under pressure for change in all Nordic countries. This pressure is due to changes both in the international operating environment and in the political environment within the countries. We have the privilege of living in a well-functioning parliamentary democracies, and this is not self-evident even in all European countries today. But as we know, the key feature of parliamentary democracies is that policies change as governments change. This applies also to development policy, and therefore the priorities of development policy change from one government term to another. On the other hand, then, predictability and consistency are virtues in all decision-making, and they play an even more important role in development policy, where results require, almost without exceptions, activities that extend over one parliamentary term. In Finland, predictability and consistency are supported by the parliamentary report on development policy prepared by a parliamentary working group in 2021. So, for discussion that follows in a while, one question might be, what other measures than this parliamentary report there are or could be that would increase predictability and consistency of our development policies over time? Before finishing, I would like to emphasize that development policy is not an independent policy area that should be made or even could be made in a silo, as our Norwegian presenter also pointed out. Development policy is an essential and indispensable part of foreign and security policy. This means that changes in development policy need to be assessed also from the perspective of foreign and security policy. As our development policies are evolving, what impact does this have on our broader foreign and security policies? Maybe our panelists could reflect also on this in discussion. But once more, thank you for making this huge effort. We really should learn from it in order to make more effective and consistent development policy in all Nordic countries. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Sami Pirkkala from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And now it's time for our panel discussion of today, as a cherry on the cake. Great, thank you very much for all the speaks already. And now we move on to, we've got roughly half an hour time to go through all these very complex and interesting themes of today. So let's start off with exploring the actual study. In the light of the study and the current political situation in your respective countries, what do you see the main risks to the quality of aid and its purpose? Marikki, would you like to start?
Okay, thank you, Kimmo. I think, in my opinion, maybe the greatest concern in Finland would be that we would face again a similar situation than back in 2015, so that we would be facing massive cuts again. Of course, in a very gloomy economic situation, and that we also already have austerity measures, especially by the opposition, very much called for, and of course we can understand the reasons why. But at the same time, we are moving towards that direction, despite the rising needs in the world. So the aftermath of COVID pandemic, humanitarian crisis, climate change and biodiversity loss. So this is kind of this very, very interesting puzzle. And I think that, as we also noted in the paper, that the purpose of aid in Finland has not been that crystal clear. It has been poverty reduction, inequality reduction, plus many other issues. So in terms of purpose of aid, when times are getting harder, I see more competition to come over ever more scarce resources. So that, I think, will shape the purpose, and that might also be a risk. And of course, if we are allocating our funds to those actors that are maybe not that keen on not adhering that carefully to all the principles of effective aid, that of course then can be seen in the quality and of course how we, for instance, implement our human rights-based approach. So these are just a few concerns that they are with the current situation.
Thank you, Marikki, and would Jan want to continue?
Trying to find a button, yeah. Well, thanks. Well, of course, one of the main worries you would have is for other policy areas and considerations of having other policy priorities to influence aid policy. The Swedish government has now, the new Swedish government has now announced a large aid reform, but it's, I would say, as of now, it's too early to say how's that going to play out and what's that going to consist of. But to the extent that there are other policy interests affecting aid, of course, that would affect quality. And of course, also, if you think that aid today spent is doing anything good, decreasing the volume of aid will, of course, affect the quality overall, whereas I do not believe that the volume aid is a determinant for the quality of aid. Of course, it will have to do how you use it. But it remains to be seen, but I think there's a potential challenge between the decrease in volumes and the actual increase, I would say, in priorities as announced now by the new government, but we'll see how that plays out. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Elling, you just mentioned that Norway is becoming the wealthiest Nordic country, but what do you see as the main risks to the quality of aid?
I think for Norway, but also for the other Nordic countries, is that we may have a situation where the Nordic countries are not able to maintain a focus on reducing poverty in poor countries of the world, which requires long-term commitment to that purpose. And I think we made good progress with the Millennium Development Goals. There's really a crisis for the Sustainable Development Goals and extreme poverty objectives there. So that is, the single biggest challenge.
Thank you. And over to Mette on Teams. The same question: what do you see as the main risks?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think it probably goes for all countries, but maybe in particular where the other policy concerns matter most. As Jan was saying, I agree very much that that's a danger. It doesn't have to be, but if you do not have that conversation about what is efficient and aid, what is the best effectiveness, how does development aid in 2022 look like, or 2023? So what is good quality aid? We know that aid works best if the recipient is in the driver's seat, for instance. But if development policy decisions then become driven not by recipient wishes, and we don't let recipients control aid, but we rather let it be dominated by what we can do and what we want, then that would be a problem for quality of aid.
Great, thank you. Right, let's move on to a more positive note. Are there any factors in the present situation that would increase the relevance of aid? What would Elling want to start this time?
Yes, that is very much linked to.
There we go.
That's very much linked to what I said in my response to your first question. And the relevance of aid relates to the deepening of poverty and worsening of inequality in many parts of developing countries. So that is a major reason for the relevance of aid. And unfortunately, in the conflict-affected, the fragile countries, aid is the main source of for development.
Thank you. Over to you, Jan.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with Elling. I mean, there's no question that kind of the need and the severity of people in need of aid are increasing, and of course that puts a challenge. But in order to then be positive, one thing that I think the Swedish government has done now in terms of financing and in terms also of relating to what Sami said about predictability of aid, I think was the word you were using, is that the Swedish aid frame is frozen at a certain level. Even whether it's 1% or frozen at $56 million, it doesn't matter. It's frozen at a specific volume. It acts both as a ceiling and a floor. And when you are using aid money to pay for domestic costs for asylum seekers to Sweden, historically, changes in those volume, that is in those costs, has severely affected kind of what's left for other aid. And what's new with this government now is that they have capped that amount to 8% of the aid budget. So that would be something that will increase predictability and will be kind of a positive new change.
Yes, you were saying earlier that there is that increased composition of the aid and in different sectors, not just targeting abroad. And at the same time, the climate change is making predicting the future even more difficult. How do you see that as obviously, like, even though there is that commitment to that 1.7, but how do you see these kind of like factors that are happening, as we saw especially in 2015, in that kind of surge in asylum seeker applications? Do you see that how that's been taken into consideration, that these kind of events might be happening in the near future?
Well, I mean, to the extent that what we saw in Sweden in 2015 would repeat itself, funds for that would have to be taken from other sources than from ODA. So to that respect, it's a positive thing. But then, of course, I mean, there are a lot of competing needs, not least climate finance. And that's also a priority with the new government, also that they're going to prioritize large emitters. And as we know, those would typically tend to be middle-income countries. So maybe we are moving closer to Norway in terms of channeling more funds to middle-income countries instead of low-income countries. But that remains to be seen.
Great, thank you. And then Marikki, going back to the factors in the present situation that would increase the relevance of aid, how do you see this question?
I think it is always healthy to have a debate and review the relevance of aid. So if that's a positive thing, I think that now is the moment to do it again. But I think that first and foremost, we should always keep our eye on the bigger picture. What I mean by that is, the whole system of food systems, climate measures, trade, agriculture, taxation, governance, anti-corruption. But then there are both geographic areas, Elling was mentioning fragile states, situations and issues where aid is still needed. Humanitarian, of course, crisis, a clear case in point, climate adaptation, and of course there are those goals that you really cannot advance without grant-based aid, such as gender rights or democracy and human rights at large. So I think that there is still role for aid and relevance in that regard. But I also would like to highlight the bigger picture and the externalities of our, for instance, our consumption and the way we make decisions in other policy fields that are also very important.
Thank you, Markki. And over to you, Mette. How do you see the bigger picture in terms of the relevance of the aid? What are the factors that could increase it?
I think it's a great question, and I think there is kind of almost like a paradox right now, because there is a movement from the global south that many countries want to be independent of aid, and they want, of course, to be less determined by what Western donors think and really have their own agenda, which is completely understandable. At the same time, there is more need, especially maybe now after COVID and the Ukraine crisis, and there's a debt crisis and rising energy prices and so on. So there's more need than ever, and also with the large areas of fragility and more people who are really in need of help. So how do you square that circle? I think in order to make aid relevant here, it's just so important to keep discussing different modalities and modalities where the recipient can really be, have the largest say in how aid is spent. I think that's the only way that development aid can remain relevant.
Thank you. Actually, going back to what you said earlier, Mette, you were saying that perhaps there's no such thing as the Nordic development aid model. So I was just wondering that going on to the kind of potential risks, what happens if the Nordic model of development cooperation is to lose its significance? So in the following question, I would ask you to kind of consider the question from the point of view like what would be the implications for the beneficiaries, for the aid community and multilateralism, and also obviously for your own country. And I would ask Mette to start, because you made that interesting quote early on, and you can elaborate on that.
Well, I think for a country like Denmark that has also always had like 4 legs in its foreign policy, the UN, the NATO, the Nordic countries and the European Union, I really feel that it could be nice to have a little bit more emphasis on the Nordic collaboration and the Nordic countries. I think we really have something together that we can contribute with. And I think we had a really nice discussion yesterday at the MFA where we had a comment about how, well, there is a lot of cooperation still going on between the Nordic countries on the ground, in the field, in the boards of multilateral organizations and so on. And if we can have more of that, also maybe on a more political level, at a higher level, but also maybe in a more formalized forum to exchange, learning and knowledge about what we know, I think that could be really, really good. I know that that's not an answer to all of your question, but I think there are still similarities, and we actually still share the same values as the point was made before. So I think it's a matter of maybe work more on that.
No, and obviously you don't have to cover all of these aspects that I just listed, but you can actually cover a couple of them. And if one of you wish to comment the other one's speech or sentences, please do, and just raise your hands, and we can have that debate, as Markki was earlier saying, or discussion about these very, very complex and interesting matters. But anyway, moving on to Markki, what about you? What would happen? What are the risks of Nordic model if it was to lose its significance?
First of all, I think that it all comes down to the question, what would be the content of the Nordic model? Are we able to kind of safeguard the best parts of it, or are we together moving in wrong directions? Of course, that's the starting point. But I think from the Finnish perspective, I think that we would lose an important peer group and way to benchmark our own activities, and the international community would lose forerunners, provided that the Nordic model is really, what we hope in this panel it to be. And I think from the point of view of recipients, then of course, the long-term partnerships and the quality and predictability, I think that is very important. And if we know that the rising geopolitical tensions that they are, I think that, of course, we have to also, reflect our past and our politics, but still I think that, the Nordic model is appealing to many if we then compare that to Russia or China.
And over to you, Jan.
Well, yeah, I mean, not to just repeat what you were saying, I think that, as Sami said, it's perfectly right that when political majorities change, then policies changes tend to change. Not always, as we've shown, that it's not always the case. But, I mean, it's really, you can really ask whether we have like-minded governments or like-minded countries. And sometimes, as you say, if policies are changing in a direction that would not be helpful for the quality of aid, of course, being a joint Nordic actor in that respect wouldn't really help, right? So I think, and I think that there's really one thing that, I don't know if it's threatened, but I think that multilateralism is quite important and has been kind of a Nordic important position, and Nordic actors acting as one has been important. And now the Swedish government has announced a decrease in core support to multilaterals and an increased multi-B support, that is increased earmarking, and of course it remains to be seen the extent of that change. But I think that multilateralism is fundamental for aid to in fragile situations, and multilateralism cannot be built on earmarked funds alone. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Elling, over to you.
I think it's first important to stress that although the Nordic governments may change, as we've discussed and as Jan just pointed out, there is a certain like-mindedness between the Nordic countries in our approach to development. And we are known for that. Our image abroad is about the Nordic countries doing something good. And I think the legacy is there, and it continues in certain areas. I think the norms and values of the Nordic approach to development aid, we can find it within UN thinking, we can find it within the OECD Development Assistance Committee, where the like-minded Nordic way of approaching development aid is the kind of a norm that everybody is measured against. So in that sense, the legacy lives on. And of course, it lives on in the sense that Nordic countries cooperate formally, informally in a number of multilateral fora, the World Bank, for example, where it's formalized, and also a number of other institutions. But there are, of course, a lot more that can be done if this is to be kept relevant.
Interesting. I think all of you kind of shared your thoughts on kind of how envisioning the Nordic Model 2.0. So let's elaborate on that a bit more. So what would be this Nordic Model 2.0 look like? What kind of core elements would it contain? And especially when you're looking at that like-mindedness. Shall we start with Mette?
I think that's a great question. I'm looking very much forward to hearing what the other three will say. I don't know if I have one bid, but I really think we have an advantage because we're long-standing aid donors with a lot of experience on the ground. I fear a little bit that we are on our way to throwing the baby out with the bathwater, in the sense that all our knowledge from on-the-ground development work vanishes if everything or more aid is going into humanitarian or multilateral channels. But then again, I agree completely with Jan, we need multilateralism. So I think we need, I don't know what the answer is, but I know that we need a debate on the balance between bilateral and multilateral aid and what each can do. And we need a debate about how we best incorporate knowledge of how to do long-term development on the ground into our development policies. And I think the Nordic countries are in a very good position to do so. So that would be part of what a Nordic model 2.0 would look at least.
Thank you. What about Jan?
Well, I think in the sake of, because since I agreed with everything Mette said, I think that I'm just going to skip this one because...
That's a good start for the new model, yeah. Over to you, Elinka.
When it's difficult to respond to a question with a short answer, we tend to say this is a very interesting question. And it is. I think there is scope for the Nordic countries to do more. In the past, there was a lot of cooperation around country programs and project support, but we don't really provide that much aid like that anymore. So it would have to be something different. It's not really that difficult. I think it's all about the 8 ministers of the 4 Nordic countries coming together, sitting down. Is there something we can do together? An agenda that we can push at the multilateral scene. I'm thinking now of 2 examples. The Utstein Group was a joint effort between the Norwegian aid minister and the British and the German and the Dutch minister, all females. And they sat down and agreed what can we do to make aid more effective. And that was quite instrumental at a certain stage in shaping the aid effectiveness agenda. And they agreed on a division of labor. Okay, you take on the World Bank, I'll push it through the UNDP, and so on. And it made a difference. And I think if you look further back, there are precedents for this also in Nordic cooperation. In May or June, I think I was in Finland, Helsinki, talking to a side event of the Nordic Africa Foreign Ministers meeting, and they reflected upon the Kalevi Sorsa initiative from the 1980s, where the Nordic countries, led by Finland, took an initiative to broaden the cooperation between the Nordic countries and Southern Africa. And it was an important political initiative at the time. It also achieved something, and it created a new dynamic in the relations between the Nordic countries and Southern Africa at the time, which was important. And I think it's possible to do something like this, not in the same area, of course, if the Nordic aid ministers would agree to do so. And it takes one aid minister in one country to sit down with the others and see if they could come up with something. And as we pointed out earlier, there is a lot of irrelevant issues that could be addressed, and where the Nordics, building upon their past reputations and their still large aid volumes, could make a difference if they wanted to.
Thank you very much, Elling. And Marik.
Very much seconding, of course, what has been said before. Maybe to add on something, maybe also critical self-reflection sometimes, it's needed. And I would like to see that we would have this aid model that would be really based on the best principles and practices, but we would also look at it in the larger framework of sustainable development and understand better also our kind of footprint in the world, so that we would be able to kind of see the bigger picture. But having aid there is one of the key elements, but not also looking at the same time beyond aid.
Thank you, Mark. And at this stage, we'll take some questions from the audience, and Sebastian Tynkkynen, member of the Parliament, will start. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you, Kimmo, very much, and thank you, experts. This study is very interesting, and I read it totally because already have learned so much during this meeting. In Finland, with MFA policies, I think we have been swifting from talking about development aid and being good Samaritans more to the direction of being partners. And maybe from many reasons, for example, highlighting that we are equal actors, and also putting the responsibility also more to the country who is actually receiving the help. I would like to learn if this is the development in other Nordic countries also as well as in Finland. Thank you.
Thank you. Marek wants to start.
Perhaps the question was more to our Nordic
Yes.
colleagues.
Oh, sorry, yes, sorry, yeah.
Well, I can start by just referring to Mette earlier referred to the OECD peer reviews, and Sweden has often been commended for being a donor that, to a very large extent, work with the effectiveness principles, ownership and partnership and transparency and so on, results focus. So I would say that yes, that is has been, and I think will still be something that Sweden is relatively good at.
And over to Mette in Denmark.
Yes, but could you please just repeat the question, because I had trouble hearing it?
I hope you can hear me now. So my question was that is that the direction also in other Nordic countries, that we don't so much highlight ourselves as like good Samaritans and giving development aid, being good donors, but instead we talk about partnerships and doing things in cooperation? Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, yeah, I think I agree very much also because, you know, it's one of the things that we know from experience works when, you know, you want to deliver effective aid, that there's a genuine partnership in implementation, and also that there's patience. I think to some extent many countries are moving a little bit away from the issue of like ownership and partnership. The whole Paris Declaration seems like it's not having as much room, and also I don't know, I mean, of course there's a 17th goal in the SDGs about partnerships, but to me it's as if it doesn't receive as much emphasis as earlier, which is a shame. I think for Danish development aid there's still a lot of emphasis on partnerships in the field and practice, but if you look at our policy declarations and so on, it's a lot to do with, you know, Danish solutions, you know, Danish development policy is also good for Denmark and so on. So more domestic concerns, and that, I mean, I think our development policy could be enlightened by having, you know, partnerships back in focus.
Thank you. And then Elling, and then I'll ask for a comment from Marikki after that.
Just very briefly to add another dimension to the responses from my colleagues here. And yes, I think aid effectiveness or parts of that agenda is living on. But I think it's also important to realize that perhaps more so in Norway than in the other countries, but I'm not sure. And that is that the management of aid is also a bit fragmented. If you go to the NORAD, which is the, you know, has a strong aid competence, that emphasis and focus is very strong. While in the foreign ministry, which still manages half the aid, it is very much more uneven. And there other foreign policy interests and objectives tend to be more pronounced in some sections.
Marikki, like Sebastian Tynkkinen pointed out, especially in the 90s, us Nordic countries were seen as the good Samaritans, but that view has changed. So what thoughts did all the three colleagues of yours, their comments brought in you?
I think that the question was excellent. In our study, it was quite evident that maybe in Finnish case, we have had the domestic interest quite strongly there since the beginning. I mean, during the period of time that we are looking at the past 30 years. So in a way, maybe we have been different in that regard, that, you know, we have always kind of looked, you know, what is there for Finland in terms of our international identity or so forth. But that's true that, you know, the partnership kind of dimension is much stronger. But I would always advise to look at, you know, inside, what does it really entail? My problem is that when we are talking about aid, we cannot really escape the power structure. There's the other party that has the resources. But of course, there are those, much hinges on the way in which we orchestrate that aid and projects and programs around that. So that's why I have always this message that if we place that question to the bigger framework and looking at the effects of our policies, our decisions and the structures, although it sounds complicated, that also highlights, in a way, the true partnerships outside the aid.
Great, thank you. We've got time for one more question from the audience. Over to you.
Is the one just by pushing, or?
You might need to push both plates at the same time.
Plates? Okay,
There we go.
right, perfect. Thanks. So my name is Milma Kettunen. I work in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in the Development Communications at the time. I'd like to ask you about a specific theme, and that's gender equality. It seems that, especially in Finland, that is a theme that is very widely supported, be it like in all the parties, for example. And I think it has been a theme that has been also very widely, supported by all Nordic countries. So I'd like to ask from the others, not so much from Finland, but you others, how is the theme seen now in your countries? Do you see any change in there? Is the support there still, or could that be some of the one of the themes that is still connecting all the Nordics?
Great, and we'll have brief answers for all three other Nordic countries because we've got 3 minutes time left. So Mette, would you like to start with a brief outline as an answer to her question?
Okay, so
Gender equality. Did you hear the question?
yeah, about how I see gender inequality or the focus on gender equality in our development policy.
Yeah, and any change in those policies and attitudes towards that theme?
Well, I actually see gradually a stronger emphasis on this, and I think not just in terms of like mentioning gender equality as a cross-cutting issue, but also more and more like specific programs, maybe especially on sexual and reproductive rights. I see that we're supporting also many different multilateral organizations in terms of sexual and reproductive rights. Actually, right now, as we speak, there's an evaluation of our gender equality measures being carried out for the Danish MFA. Yeah.
Thank you, and then over to Jan, and then Elling, brief answers.
Very brief, okay. So gender is an integrated perspective, hugely prioritized in Swedish development cooperation. It will be under the new government as well. It's been announced, even though the foreign ministry has declared that this new government will also put an end to the Swedish feminist foreign policy. And we do have an evaluation of the Swedish feminist foreign policy coming out in spring. So keep your eyes open for that. Thanks.
Thank you. That was fantastic brief answer.
Yes, gender is formally defined as one of the 4 cross-cutting objectives in Norwegian development aid, and there's a strong political emphasis on it whenever the ministers make speeches and statements around the issues. And it's very evident partly in Norway's single biggest intervention area, which is global health, where there is a very strong focus on sexual and reproductive rights. So that's one area where this is very visible. And then it is visible from a different perspective with the Norwegian National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, which approaches this from a slightly different angle. But in those 2 areas, it is very visible, and where you can see the big funds going. But whenever there is a decision document about any aid intervention, those responsible for that would have to address a box in the document which deals with gender equality. So I mean, it's pretty high on the agenda.
Thank you. Unfortunately, this is all we've got time for this time, but I really would like to thank you, and I'm sure I speak for all of us here that you gave us a lot of food for thought and even instruments for further collaboration in the future between different parties. And I would like to thank you for the excellent participation and questions to our panelists. I would like to give one more round of applause to our excellent panelists. And of course to you, dear audience. Thank you, Mets, over there in Denmark. That's it. Thank you very much, and thank you. Special thanks to our special guests who made such an effort to travel here from your respective countries, and I wish you safe travels back home. And thank you very much for coming over here, and the work continues. And now I wish you all very safe travels home in this Arctic environment, and I wish you a very good Christmas time. Thank you and goodbye.